Monterey's most luxurious ballroom sparkled that night as if the world had no problems. 500 lit candles, white flowers imported from Holland, champagne that cost more than many families spend in a month. And at the center of it all, Rodrigo Montoya. A tailored black suit, a firm jawline, the eyes of a man who had built an empire from scratch. Everyone was looking at him. Everyone was smiling. Everyone was celebrating, except him, because there was something in that ballroom that didn't fit, something Rodrigo couldn't quite put his finger on yet, a small, silent unease like a thorn lodged in his chest that doesn't hurt enough to make him scream, but won't stop hurting either. Isabel was by his side, beautiful, perfect, the red dress clinging to her figure as if she had been born for that night. Senator Vargas's daughter smiled at the guests with the grace of someone who grew up learning exactly how to behave in front of the cameras. Every gesture calculated, every word measured. Rodrigo raised his glass of champagne. He didn't take a single sip. The mariachi band began to play near the stage. Conversations filled the air. Someone mentioned his name with admiration. Someone else raised a glass in his direction. He barely noticed, because his eyes were doing something he hadn't ordered them to do. They scanned the room, table by table, corner by corner, as if they were looking for something, as if they knew before he did that there was something there that needed to be found. And then they stopped. At the far end of the room, almost pressed against the wall, a woman in uniform was cleaning the marble floor with slow, careful movements. Black skirt, white blouse, dark hair pulled back into a tight braid. Nothing about her stood out among the hotel staff, nothing except for one thing. Her belly, big, round, impossible to ignore. Rodrigo frowned slightly. Something about that figure seemed familiar to him. He didn't know why. He couldn't explain it. She was just another worker among dozens who were serving, cleaning, and passing invisibly among the rich that night. But his eyes didn't move. They remained fixed on her. The woman bent down slowly to reach a corner of the floor. The movement was clumsy, heavy, like that of someone who has been carrying too much weight for too long. With one hand, she held the mop. With the other, she leaned briefly on her knee. And in that instant, she turned her head. Just for a second. Just long enough for the candlelight to illuminate her profile. Rodrigo felt the air leave his lungs in one sudden rush. The champagne glass nearly slipped from his hand. He recognized that profile. He recognized that small nose, that soft curve at the corner of her lips, that particular way she tilted her head when she was focused on something. He knew it because for 2 years it had been the first thing he saw every morning when he woke up. He knew it because for 2 years it had been his reason to keep going when everything else was falling apart. He knew it because 8 months ago that woman disappeared from his life, leaving only a sheet of paper on the table. You deserve a better life than this. Valentina. The name struck his mind like a stone hitting water. Valentina Reyes, his ex-wife. The woman who had abandoned him when he had nothing. The woman who hadn't answered a single call, not a single message, not a single sign of life in 8 months. She was there, on her knees, on the floor of his engagement party, pregnant. Rodrigo couldn't move. He couldn't speak. He couldn't think clearly. He could only stay exactly where he was, while a question exploded inside his chest with a force he hadn't expected. Whose baby was that? And even more terrifying, how many months had she been carrying that alone? What Rodrigo didn't know at that moment, what none of the 500 guests in that room could have imagined, was that the answer to those questions would destroy everything that night was supposed to celebrate. And that before dawn, nothing, absolutely nothing, would ever be the same again. Hi friends, if this story has already hooked you from the very first minute, hit like right now and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what's coming. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We'll read all your comments. Rodrigo didn't move for almost a full minute, All around him, the room kept spinning. Laughter, music, the clinking of glasses, the murmur of conversations between politicians and business people who felt important that night. Everything continued exactly as before. But for him, time had stopped. His eyes remained fixed on Valentina. She hadn't seen him. Her head was still bowed toward the floor, carefully maneuvering the mop between the legs of the chairs. Her movements were slow, deliberate, like those of someone who has learned not to draw attention to herself. Rodrigo knew those movements. He had seen them 1,000 times. The same way she leaned forward when she was concentrating, the same way she bit her lower lip when something demanded patience. Valentina had always had that strange ability to turn the humblest work into something dignified, as if every task, no matter how small, deserved to be done well. It was that, precisely that made him fall in love with her the first time. 3 years ago, Rodrigo Montoya was a man with a surname but no direction. He had money, yes, or rather, he had access to his father's money. He had a name that opened doors in Monterrey. He had a future perfectly mapped out by Don Ernesto Montoya, his father, a businessman with more pride than heart. Rodrigo just had to follow the path others had built for him. Marry Isabel Vargas, unite families, strengthen political connections. Rodrigo was 30 years old and already felt old. One Tuesday afternoon, on a business trip to Guadalajara, he walked into a small stationery shop in the city center almost by chance. He needed a notebook, an excuse to get out of the hotel, really, to breathe a little away from his father's calls and the lawyer's emails. The stationery shop smelled of paper and cinnamon. Behind the counter was a young woman arranging notebooks on a shelf, dark hair falling loosely over her shoulders, a navy blue apron, her lips moving silently, as if she were singing something only she could hear. She didn't look at him when he walked in. That was the first thing that caught his attention. Everyone he knew always looked at him when he walked into a place. They knew who he was. They reacted to his last name. But this woman simply kept arranging her notebooks as if a customer's arrival were the most normal thing in the world. Which it was, of course, but Rodrigo wasn't used to normality. "Good afternoon," she said without turning around. "How can I help you?" Rodrigo stood in front of the counter, not knowing exactly what to say. "I'm looking for a notebook," he said at last. She pointed to the shelf on her right without stopping to arrange the notebooks. "They're over there. The hardcover ones are on top. The cheaper ones are on the bottom." Rodrigo didn't move toward the shelf. "Which one do you recommend?" That certainly made her turn around. She looked at him with a slightly curious expression. Dark eyes, a small scar above her left eyebrow that he noticed immediately without knowing why. A brief, almost involuntary smile, as if the question had struck her as more interesting than expected. "It depends," she said. "What do you want it for?" "To write down ideas," Rodrigo replied. "Business, projects." She nodded slowly. "Then hardcover. It lasts longer. And important ideas deserve something that doesn't bend easily." Rodrigo looked at her for a moment. "That's the most sensible thing anyone has said to me in weeks." She frowned slightly, as if unsure whether to believe him or not. Then she smiled genuinely. A small smile, uncalculated, unintentional. Just genuine. Her name was Valentina Reyes, daughter of Doña Carmen, a lifelong domestic worker, raised in a small apartment in Tlaquepaque with 3 uncles, 2 cousins, and the conviction that honest work was worth more than any last name. She had none of the things Rodrigo's world considered important, and for some reason that took him weeks to understand. That was exactly what kept him coming back to that stationery shop time and again, first with excuses, a pen, 1 more notebook, a stapler he didn't need, then without excuses, just to talk to her. Valentina had a habit of reading during quiet moments at work, Books of all kinds were stacked behind the counter: economics, novels, Mexican history, cookbooks. She read everything that fell into her hands with the same intensity. One afternoon, while it was raining outside in Guadalajara, Rodrigo asked her if she believed that a person without connections could build something real from scratch. Valentina slowly closed her book. She looked at him. "My whole life has been built by people without connections," she said. "My mum worked 30 years cleaning other people's houses to give me one of my own. That's building from scratch. Everything else is just pretty excuses." Rodrigo didn't say anything, but something inside him fell into place. Like a piece that had been out of place for years, he fell in love with her without realizing it, which is the only real way to fall in love. There was no exact moment. There was no dramatic revelation. It was just an accumulation of afternoons at the stationery store, of conversations that started about books and ended about life, of the way Valentina listened, truly, without thinking about what she was going to say while he spoke. When he told his father he wanted to marry her, Don Ernesto slammed his fist on the table. When Rodrigo insisted, Don Ernesto cut him off completely. Bank accounts, properties, contacts, business network, everything. Overnight, Rodrigo Montoya went from having everything to having nothing. And Valentina, without hesitating for a second, told him the same thing she'd told him that rainy afternoon at the stationery store. "You can build from scratch. I know how to do it. I'll teach you." That was what Rodrigo remembered now as he watched her on her knees on the marble floor. The woman who taught him how to build, the woman who disappeared just as the building was finally beginning to rise, and who now, with her enormous belly and hotel uniform, was cleaning the floor on the most important night of her new life, unaware that he was watching her, unaware that everything was about to change. What Rodrigo didn't know, what he never knew, was what happened on the other side. The night Valentina left. It had been a Tuesday. Rodrigo hadn't slept well in 3 days. The latest investor had cancelled the meeting with a 2-line message. No explanations, no apologies. Just a no, wrapped in corporate language that actually said something simpler and crueler: "We don't bet on losers." Valentina heard him hang up the phone from the kitchen. She said nothing. She poured 2 cups of coffee, placed one in front of him, and sat down across the small table they'd bought second-hand at a flea market in Tlaquepaque. The table had one leg shorter than the others. They always propped it up with a folded piece of cardboard. Rodrigo stared at his computer screen without seeing anything. Valentina looked at Rodrigo, and what she saw broke something inside her. It wasn't the physical exhaustion that hurt her most. It was something else. It was seeing how that man, who had walked into her stationery shop with eyes full of questions and the energy of someone who believes the world has a solution, that man was fading away, slowly, like a candle in a room with no air, because of her. That was what Valentina couldn't get out of her head, because of her. If Rodrigo had followed the path his father had laid out for him, he'd be in an office in Monterrey right now, with financial backing, political connections, and the Montoya name opening every door for him. Instead, he was there, in a 25-square-meter apartment with a wobbly table and a computer that took 3 minutes to boot up. That night, when Rodrigo finally fell asleep at his desk, Valentina did something she'd been avoiding for weeks. She let herself cry, alone in the tiny bathroom with the faucet running so he wouldn't hear her, and as she cried, she made a decision, the hardest one she'd ever made in her life. She wrote the note at 4 in the morning. She rewrote it 5 times. Each version said too much or too little. In one, she wrote everything: the love, the pain, the real reason. She tore it up. In another, she wrote just one word. She tore that up too. In the end, there were 2 lines left. "You deserve a better life than this. I never stopped loving you." She tucked them under the coffee cup he hadn't finished. She grabbed her bag, her documents. The small photo they had stuck on the fridge, the two of them smiling on the beach in Mazatlan during the only weekend they'd managed to get away that year. She folded it carefully and tucked it into the bottom of the bag. She slipped out quietly. The door clicked softly as it closed, and Valentina Reyes set off on foot through the empty streets of Guadalajara at 4:30 in the morning, convinced she had just done the best she could for the man she loved. The first few weeks were the hardest. She went to Mexico City because it was the place where it was easiest to become invisible. A distant cousin, Marisol, let her crash on her couch for 10 days without asking too many questions. Valentina got a job cleaning at a restaurant in the Roma neighborhood. The early morning shift, from 11 p.m. to 6 a.m. She'd get home just as the city was waking up. She'd sleep for 4 hours. She'd get up and look for another shift. It was in the 6th week that the dizziness began. At first she attributed it to exhaustion, to the change in schedule, to poor nutrition. But the dizziness didn't stop. It became part of the daily routine, along with the nausea that struck without warning, and the fatigue that sleep could no longer shake off. A co-worker looked at her one day with that expression women have when they already know before you do. "Sweetie," she said quietly as they arranged the restaurant chairs, "when was your last period?" Valentina froze. She counted backward, and the world tilted slightly beneath her feet. The public clinic in the Guerrero neighborhood smelled of disinfectant and patience. Valentina waited 2 hours and 40 minutes sitting in an orange plastic chair before they called her. The nurse was young, efficient, friendly without being sentimental. She asked her the routine questions. She handed her the results on a printed sheet of paper. Valentina read it 3 times. Then she went out into the hallway and sat on the floor with her back against the wall. She stayed there for an hour, without crying, without moving, just breathing, pregnant, 6 weeks. Rodrigo. The name flashed through her mind immediately like a bolt of lightning. She wanted to grab the phone. She wanted to dial that number she still knew by heart, even though she had deleted the contact to avoid giving in to temptation. But she didn't. Because that very night, on the old phone she used to look for work, she went to a business news site, and she saw it, a photograph. Rodrigo Montoya in a suit that wasn't the same one he always wore. More elegant, more confident. The headline read, "Young Monterrey entrepreneur secures $1 million investment for tech platform." He was smiling in the photo. It was the smile Valentina remembered from the early days. The smile that had gradually faded during the months of failure and debt. It was back. She stared at that photograph for a long time. And then she closed the page. She caressed her belly with the palm of her hand, barely an involuntary gesture, almost unconscious. He was making it. Without her, he was making it. That meant her decision had been the right one. Even though it hurt, as if something had been torn out of her. Even though what was growing in her belly was the living proof that that love had been real. Valentina folded the paper from the clinic. She tucked it next to the photo from Mazatlan at the bottom of her bag. And she moved on, because she had no other choice, because that baby was going to need a whole mother, not a broken one. And because sometimes truly loving someone means stepping back so they can shine. Even if no one sees you do it, even if no one ever thanks you for it. Isabel Vargas wasn't a woman who wasted time. She'd been watching Rodrigo from across the room for 20 minutes. She knew him well enough to tell when his mind was elsewhere, and that night his mind had been elsewhere for far too long. She followed the direction of his gaze. It took her a moment to find the exact spot where his eyes had settled. Then she found it. A hotel worker at the far end of the room. Uniform, mop, a prominent belly beneath the white blouse. Isabel frowned. She studied the woman with the cold, surgical focus of someone accustomed to detecting threats before they become problems. The profile, the braid, the distinctive way she moved. Then she remembered. She had seen photos, old blurry ones taken from social media profiles that someone had sent her over a year ago when the situation with Rodrigo was still uncertain. Photos of a young woman in a small apartment. Photos that hadn't worried her much at the time because the matter had resolved itself. The woman had left, but now she was back. On her knees, on the floor of her engagement party, Isabel set her glass down on the nearest table with a precise movement and walked toward the far end of the room. Valentina sensed the footsteps before she saw the person. There was something about the rhythm of that walk that didn't belong to the hotel staff. Too determined, too direct. She looked up slowly and found herself face to face with Isabel Vargas, less than 2 meters away. The red dress, the straight shoulders, the eyes of someone who had never in her life had to clean anyone's floor. Valentina said nothing. Neither did Isabel at first. She looked her up and down with calculated slowness. She paused at her belly. A small, cold smile appeared on her lips. What a surprise, she said loud enough for everyone to hear. The ex-wife, in person. A few nearby heads turned. Valentina gripped the mop tightly. I came to work, she said quietly. Nothing more. Isabel tilted her head slightly. Sure. She paused briefly. And do you always choose to work at your ex-husband's parties, or was this time special? More heads turned. The radius of silence around the two women slowly expanded, like when a stone falls into water. Valentina kept her voice calm. I didn't know it was his party until I got here. Isabel let out a short laugh. Oh, of course not. She took a step toward her. Look, I'm going to be straight with you because I don't have time to waste. She lowered her voice slightly, but not enough. Rodrigo already has a life, a real life, with real people. She gestured broadly toward the room. This isn't your world. It never was. Valentina breathed slowly. I know. The answer seemed to throw Isabel off for a second. She'd expected resistance, not calm. She recovered quickly. Then finish your shift and leave. Her eyes dropped to Valentina's belly. And take that with you. The silence that followed was one of those heavy ones. Valentina didn't respond, but something changed in her expression. It wasn't anger. It was something deeper and harder to sustain. It was the look of a woman who'd just been struck right where it hurts the most and is deciding in real time whether to let herself fall. She chose not to fall. She placed a hand on her belly. Slowly, without drama, just a gesture. And that silent gesture was what Rodrigo saw from across the room. He had been walking toward them from the moment he saw Isabel rise from her chair. He arrived just in time not to hear the words, but to see everything else. The circle of guests watching, Isabel with that posture of someone who has just won something, and Valentina, with her hand on her belly and her eyes shining with a dignity that cost her everything to maintain. Enough is enough. Rodrigo's voice cut through the air. Isabel turned toward him. Her expression changed instantly. Surprise at first, then something like a warning. Rodrigo, I was just clarifying. I told you enough is enough. He didn't raise his voice. It wasn't necessary. Isabel looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at Valentina. Then she looked back at him, and in that split second, she read something on his face that she didn't like. Without saying another word, she gathered her composure as if picking up a coat from the floor and walked back toward the center of the room. The guests who had been watching quickly pretended they hadn't been. The room returned to its usual bustle. Valentina was still standing with her hand on her belly. Rodrigo was less than a meter away. Their eyes met for the first time in 8 months, and neither of them knew what to say. Rodrigo spoke first. Come with me. It wasn't a question, nor was it an order. It was something in between. The voice of a man using all his energy to stay calm when inside everything is shaking. Valentina shook her head slowly. I have to finish my shift. Valentina, Rodrigo, please. Her voice was low, firm, tired. Don't do this here. He glanced around briefly. Some guests were still glancing in their direction. An event photographer had noticed them. "Then outside," he said. "2 minutes." Valentina hesitated. The baby moved inside her, a small, gentle bump against her ribs, as if it, too, had an opinion on the matter. She closed her eyes for a second. Then she nodded. The service corridor behind the ballroom smelled of detergent and cold metal. Ventilation ducts in the ceiling, boxes of supplies stacked against the wall, cleaning carts lined up in military order. It was the side of the hotel the guests never saw, the side where the real work took place. Valentina went in first. Rodrigo closed the door behind him. The sound of the mariachi was muffled on the other side. Now it was just them. And the silence. Rodrigo looked at her for a moment without speaking. She looked different and yet exactly the same. Her face was thinner. Her eyes were more tired. But she had that same upright posture she'd always had, that way of standing in the world, as if the world had no right to bend her. "Are you okay?" he asked. Valentina let out a small, humorless laugh. "That's the first thing you ask me. It's the first thing I need to know." She looked at him. Something in her expression softened slightly, just for an instant, before hardening again. "I'm fine," she said. "We're both fine. Both of us." Rodrigo processed that word slowly. "Is it a girl?" Valentina nodded. He exhaled through his nose. His eyes dropped to her belly and rose again to her face. "How far along are you?" 8 months. The math was simple, brutal, inevitable. Rodrigo calculated it without meaning to, without being able to help himself. 8 months ago, Valentina was still with him. Who's the father? The question slipped out before he could stop it. It wasn't cruel. It was desperate. It was the question of a man who needs the answer to be one thing and is terrified that it might be that very thing. Valentina looked him straight in the eyes. She didn't look away. "You." A single word. Rodrigo didn't move. "What?" "That you're the father, Rodrigo." The hallway suddenly felt very small. Or maybe it was him who had grown very large. Or maybe it was the silence that filled all the available space and left no room for anything else. "You didn't know," he said. It wasn't a question. Valentina shook her head. "When I left, I didn't know. I found out 6 weeks later. And you didn't call me?" She held his gaze. "I'd seen the news about your company, the investor, the headline." She paused briefly. "You were getting ahead, finally, without the weight of everything that didn't work out when you were with me." Rodrigo opened his mouth. "Valentina, let me finish." Her voice didn't tremble. "Then I saw the photos with Isabel, and I understood that you already had a new life, a life that made sense, that worked." She looked down at the floor for a moment and looked up again. "I wasn't going to show up with all this and destroy it. That decision wasn't yours to make. It was the only one I could make. You were going to have my daughter all by yourself. I'm already having her all by myself." The words fell between them like a heavy weight. Rodrigo ran his hand through his hair. He turned toward the wall. He took a breath. He turned back. 8 months, Valentina. 8 months cleaning floors and carrying this burden alone. I did what I could. You could have called me and ruined what you were building." He shook his head gently. "No, I preferred this. This." He gestured toward the hallway, the uniform, the cleaning cart in the background. "You preferred this?" Valentina didn't answer, but her eyes said what her mouth wouldn't. Yes, she'd rather carry the weight of it all alone than be the reason he suffered again. Rodrigo understood her, and that was what hurt him the most. Not the secret, not the 8 months of silence, not the distance or the 2-line note he found on the table that morning. What hurt him the most was realizing that Valentina loved him so much she had chosen to disappear so he could breathe. He took a step closer. She didn't back away. "What's her name?" The question took her by surprise. It was the last one she expected. Her lips barely moved. "Alma," she said softly. Rodrigo nodded slowly. as if the name said it all. As if somehow, without knowing it, Valentina had named exactly what the two of them had been carrying for 8 months. Alma, what remains when everything else is gone. What neither of them knew at that moment was that on the other side of the door, Isabel Vargas had been standing completely still for almost 3 minutes, listening, and the expression on her face wasn't one of surprise. It was that of someone who had just decided that this wasn't going to end here. Rodrigo's mansion was on the outskirts of Monterrey, large, quiet, with gardens that no one had asked for, but that the architect included, because that's how the homes of important men were built. Valentina arrived without wanting to arrive. Rodrigo hadn't given her a choice. In the hotel hallway, after the silence that followed the mention of Alma's name, he simply said, "You're not going to keep working tonight." And something in his voice, not the authority, but the fear beneath the authority, convinced her not to fight it. The driver took them without asking. Valentina slept almost the entire way, with her cheek pressed against the cold glass of the window. She didn't want to fall asleep. Her body simply decided on its own, as the bodies of pregnant women have been doing for months, to take what it needed without asking permission. Rodrigo didn't sleep. He watched her the whole way. In the morning, the house smelled of coffee and silence. Valentina woke up in a bed that was 3 times bigger than the entire room where she had been living. She lay still for a moment, staring at the ceiling. She heard birds outside. She heard the wind in the trees in the garden. Alma stirred. "I know," Valentina whispered. "I know." She was sitting in the kitchen with a cup of tea when she heard the car. It wasn't Rodrigo's car. It was a different engine, more aggressive, braking harder than necessary on the cobblestones of the driveway. Valentina set the cup down on the table. Isabel walked in without being invited. The front door wasn't locked. That was enough for her. Rodrigo came down the stairs when he heard the door slam. He stopped on the last step. His face showed no surprise. It showed weariness. "Isabel, don't call me that as if I were just a regular visitor." Her voice filled the foyer. She was wearing the same red dress from the night before. She hadn't slept. You could tell from every inch of her face. "I brought her here, to your house, after what I heard last night. Lower your voice." "Why?" She walked toward him. "So as not to wake your pregnant ex-wife sleeping in your guest room." "Isabel, you left me alone at my own engagement party, Rodrigo." Her voice rose an octave. Outside, one of the gardeners stopped, though he hadn't meant to. Rodrigo stepped down the last step. "Listen to me carefully," he said, in a low, clear voice. "It's over between us. I made that decision last night." Isabel opened her mouth. She closed it. She opened it again. "Because of her? Because of me?" Silence. Isabel looked at him for a long moment. Then she laughed. A short, humorless laugh, the kind born of pain and disguised as contempt. "What a huge disappointment you are." She turned away, and that was when she saw Valentina. She was standing in the kitchen doorway with a cup of tea in her hand. She had heard everything. She hadn't tried to hide. Isabel walked toward her before anyone could react. "You." Her finger pointed straight at her. "You ruined everything." Valentina didn't move. "I didn't ruin anything. You appeared out of nowhere with that belly and filled his head." "Isabel, stop." Rodrigo moved, but Isabel was already too close. "Everything he built it all by himself," Valentina said calmly. "I never asked him for anything." It was that last bit of calm that snapped something in Isabel. She raised her hands, and she pushed. Time did that strange thing it does in irreversible moments. It stretched out. It became slow and detailed and cruel. Valentina lost her balance and fell backward. Her feet searched for the floor, but didn't find it in time. She fell sideways onto the marble floor with a dull, terrible thud. The silence that followed lasted less than a second. Then came the scream. If this story is touching your heart, Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Every week, we bring you stories like this, real stories of women who lost everything and found their way back. Click subscribe so you don't miss a single one. Rodrigo reached her side in 3 strides. Valentina. Her eyes were open. Her breathing was ragged. One hand pressed against her belly. Rodrigo, her voice was barely a whisper. I think it's coming. The nearest hospital was 12 minutes away. Rodrigo covered them in 7. Valentina was in the back seat with her head resting against his shoulder. Each contraction came faster than the last. Each one made her clench her teeth and shut her eyes so hard her knuckles turned white. Rodrigo held her hand. She squeezed it so hard it hurt. He didn't say anything about the pain. "We're almost there," he repeated each time. Almost there. In the ER, everything happened very fast. Nurses, a wheelchair, questions that Rodrigo answered for her because Valentina no longer had the breath for words. They wheeled her down a white hallway with neon lights while he walked beside her, never letting go of her hand, until the doors to the delivery room stopped him. "Wait here, sir." The door closed. Rodrigo was left alone in the hallway. He sat down on a grey plastic chair, and for the first time in many hours, he had nothing to do but wait and think. 2 things he wasn't prepared for that morning. He thought of Valentina on her knees on the hotel floor. He thought of the service corridor and that word spoken in a low voice, "You." He thought of 8 months, of what she had carried alone for 8 months. The early morning shifts, the public clinics, the rented rooms, all of that with Alma growing inside her without him knowing. He ran his hands over his face. Inside, Valentina screamed. The sound pierced through the door and hit him right in the chest like a physical blow. He stood up. She sat back down. There was nothing she could do. And that, for a man accustomed to solving problems, was the worst kind of torture. Inside, Valentina was fighting. Not against the pain, though the pain was immense. She was fighting against the small, cowardly voice that sometimes appears in moments of crisis to tell you that you can't do it, that you're too small for what's being asked of you, that you're alone. You're not alone, she told herself between one contraction and the next. The nurse told her to push. Valentina pushed. She told her to breathe. She breathed. She told her it was almost time. And Valentina chose to believe her because she needed to believe her, because Alma needed her to believe. "Again," said the doctor, hard. Valentina gathered everything she had left, all the exhaustion of 8 months. All the love kept silent. Everything she hadn't been able to tell anyone because there was no one to tell it to. She turned it into strength. And she pushed. The cry came at 9:17 a.m., small, furious, perfect. Valentina fell backward onto the pillow with her eyes closed and her breath ragged. She heard the cry, and something inside her melted away in a way she couldn't name. "It's a girl," the nurse said. "She's perfect." Valentina opened her eyes. They placed her on her chest. Alma, so small, so warm, with her fists clenched at the sides of her face as if she were already ready to fight the world. Valentina laughed through her tears. "Hello," she whispered. "Hello, my little girl, you're here." Rodrigo came in when the nurse went out to get him. He stopped in the doorway. Valentina was lying down with Alma in her arms. Her hair was plastered to her forehead with sweat, and her eyes were swollen from crying. She was exhausted in a way that showed in every part of her body. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen in his life. He approached slowly, as if the room was sacred and he needed permission to be there. Valentina looked at him. She gave him a small nod. "Come." Rodrigo sat down on the edge of the bed. He looked at Alma for a long moment without saying a word. The tiny fingers, the eyelashes already beginning to show, the little mouth opening and closing silently. "Do you want to hold her?" Valentina asked in a low voice. Rodrigo nodded. Valentina handed Alma to him carefully. He took her with the hands of someone who has never held anything so important and knows it, clumsily. With a reverent fear he made no attempt to hide. Alma looked at him, or so it seemed. Rodrigo felt something inside him shift forever. Like when you move a piece of furniture that's been in the wrong place for years, and suddenly the whole room makes more sense. "Hello, Alma," he said very softly. His voice cracked on the last syllable. He didn't try to fix it.